I just recently had a baby boy, and over the past few months since his birth, I spent a lot of time home alone during the day, while my fiancé is at work. A few weeks ago, we had an incident that started a rather horrifying series of events. It was early morning, around 7 a.m., and my fiancé had already left for work. After spending the morning feeding and lounging with the baby in our bedroom, he fell asleep in my arms, so I moved him to the bassinet, located right next to the queen-size bed. We live in a one-story home, so all of our rooms are ground floor. There are 2 large windows in our bedroom. They are narrow, but stretched from floor to ceiling, and let in a lot of beautiful natural light. After laying the baby down, I went into the kitchen to do some dishes. As I left the bedroom, I noticed that my cat was laying on the bed near the bassinet. When baby first came, I never left the cat unsupervised with him. My cat is a very small female cat, and very quiet. However, I know that sometimes pets can act up when a new baby is born. Our son was now about 2 months old, and the kitty has been mostly disinterested in the baby, so I was no longer worried. I grabbed the baby monitor just to be safe, but felt pretty secure letting the cat sleep in the same room as the baby. I had been in the kitchen doing dishes for about 10 minutes when I heard the baby fussing a bit on the monitor. He whimpered a few times, and I kept an ear out to see if he'd fully wake up, or if he was just falling in and out of sleep. Suddenly I hear the cat, through the monitor, hissing and growling loudly. It was a deep, throaty growl that I had never heard from her before. At the same time, the baby started wailing. The only time I had ever heard him cry, that type of cry before, was when he got his shots. It was a cry of real fear. I realized my worst fears were happening. I believed in having pets for life, and so when I found out I was pregnant, went to great lengths to prep the kitty. I wanted to make the transition good for her. I was super worried she wouldn't transition well, despite her easygoing personality, and now here we were. My cat was attacking the baby, and it was my fault for leaving them alone. At the first sound of the hissing and my baby's wailing, I dropped everything, and with soap still on my hands, sprinted the 2 rooms over back to my bedroom. I walked into a scene that I didn't expect at all. The baby was kicking around in the crib, red-faced and crying, and the cat was sitting at the foot of his bassinet, facing away from the baby. She was facing the window, across the room, puffed up, and still growling. She wasn't attacking the baby. She was positioned to defend him. I looked to the window, but saw nothing. The thick drapes were still drawn, with a small open space between the fabric where the 2 drapes met in the middle. I pulled them back, and saw nothing out front. The cat had now stopped hissing, but was still quietly growling in a hunched-up position. I picked up the baby to comfort him, and pet the kitty until she calmed down. I didn't know what to think, but I was really on edge. Why had my cat freaked out? It was so out of character for her to react to random sounds or noises. I have never seen her so afraid. I remained unsettled for a few hours, but eventually forgot about it. A few days later, this time in the evening, I sat with the baby in the living room, between the bedroom and the kitchen, reading a book. My fiancé was home, and just going to bed for the evening. It was about 9 p.m. He gets up at around 5 a.m. for work, and so he doesn't stay up very late. He was in our bedroom with the door closed, and I sat in the living room on the sofa. Our sofa is directly in front of a large bay window. It's very wide and goes floor to ceiling. The drapes are still open, and it's not quite dark outside yet. The sun is just starting to set. At some point, I sat the baby down on a mat in the middle of the living room and went to the kitchen to get something to eat. While preparing some rice, I started to get a prickly feeling on the neck. I felt as if someone was watching me, and for some reason, I felt really reluctant to look out the kitchen windows, which were also open. I quickly finished making my food and decided to take it into the living room to eat. I didn't want to spend any more time in the kitchen. I walked back into the living room, bowl in hand. The doorway faces the large windows, and so I was facing the giant windows as I walked in. And that's when I saw her. There was a woman. She looked to be in her late 20s, early 30s, and she was staring, nose pressed up against the window, looking directly at my baby. She didn't seem to notice I had walked into the room. She just intently stared at the baby. She looked angry. I felt terrified. I grabbed the baby and yelled for my fiancé. The lady in the window then took off running. My fiancé came out in his boxers and was still half asleep. I told him about the woman, and then about the previous day when the cat defended the baby. I became convinced that she had been watching the baby that day as well. This last incident happened fairly recently, and I haven't noticed anything since, but I'm afraid that she's not done yet. I honestly think she wants my baby. I can't explain why I think that, but I am convinced that she wants to kidnap him. I'm a male. When I was 19 years old, I had a 1-year-old baby boy who I took care of by myself because his mother wasn't around. I also had a best friend who lived only 1 block away from my house, and he had just had a baby as well. It was about 9:30 at night, and my baby was not falling asleep, so I was bored and decided to walk to my friend's house and say hi. I bundled my baby up inside my sweater and zipped it up with him facing my chest, so it was impossible to see him in the dark, and I started walking. Between my house and his is a small trailer park that was notorious for having a Nortino gang population living there. I was aware of this, but my walk was only a 1 block distance, so I wasn't really worried. I got to my friend's house, and we hung out for a little while until my baby finally started getting sleepy, so I decided it was time to walk back home. It was about 10 at night at this point, and really dark and cold, as it had just reached the winter season. I bundled my baby back up into my sweater, and started my walk back to my house. I'm a scrawny white boy who has been picked on and mugged and jumped and beat up by gangsters in my town several times, so it only takes me seeing one of them for my anxiety to start kicking into panic. I saw 4 of them standing on the sidewalk in front of the trailer park in my direct path to my house. I started to get very nervous because I could only see silhouettes of them, so I decided to cross the street to walk past them on the other side of the street. But as I did this, I noticed 2 of them copy my exact movements, but in my direction. The other 2 men paced around where they were, as if they were keeping watch or standing by in case I tried to run from them. That's when I knew they had bad intentions, and they were after me specifically. I honestly didn't know what I was going to do, or what I could even do. I just gripped my baby tight and looked down at him. He looked up at me with dreary eyes, halfway asleep. I prayed to myself, and wished that I'd never decided to take this walk to begin with. The 2 men got closer, and I walked faster, but the way they were walking would intercept my path, no matter where I tried to go. I knew I wouldn't be able to run with my baby inside of my shirt. I was fucked. What were they going to do? What was I going to do? The men approached me, without speaking a word. They started laughing quietly, and then they looked down to see my baby's head, barely poking out of the top of my sweater. They simply turned around, 180 degrees, and walked back to where they came from without a word. Then they all disappeared back into the shadows. I cannot tell you how relieved I felt. The sigh of relief I let out was so heartfelt and sincere, I cannot describe with words how good it felt. I walked home much faster, and decided that would be the last of my late night walks, especially with my baby. After that, I had the most confusing emotions running through my head. I was so grateful, and in a very weird way, I respected the gangsters for what they decided to do. When confronted with the fact that their victim was carrying a baby, either they feared that mugging or hurting someone with a baby would result in much bigger consequences than they were wanting, or they actually had some heart in there, somewhere deep down. At least one of them must be parents themselves, or came from a loving family. I don't know, but seriously, fuck those guys for doing what they do to innocent people. And I thank those guys for having some level of decency in their souls. Either way, let's not meet again. About 4 years ago, I lived in a college town while my husband attended the university there. I had 2 small daughters, a 2-year-old and a 6-month-old, and we loved the city. It was super family friendly, and had a ton of great places for me to spend time with my kids. One of these great places was a public library. The children's section was secluded from the rest of the building, so the kids were free to run and play without disturbing anyone. There were toys and puppet shows, a huge train set, and an awesome princess castle. My kids loved it, so we hung out there at least twice a week. One morning, I loaded my kiddos up and headed to the library. My 2-year-old was playing with the castle, her favorite. While I held the 6-month-old a few feet away, a woman approached me, gushing about how cute my baby was. I was pretty used to this. My daughter was a stunning baby. Big brown eyes, dark ringlets, and the chubbiest cheeks ever. People always came up to me, cooing at her. But this woman was different. My mommy senses started going off. I got a pit in my stomach and was immediately put on edge. She stood way too close to me and was touching my baby girl way too much. She was pinching her cheeks and rubbing her head, grabbing her little hands and kissing her, inching closer and closer all the while. She kept saying, "Oh, I just love babies. She's so pretty. I just love her." In this sort of manic, sing-song voice, I kept trying to put a little distance between us, but she wouldn't have it, always inching closer. Then she started asking to hold her. I immediately made excuses. "She's pretty tired. We need to go soon. She's really attached to me. She'll just cry." Looking back, I wish I had just told her to leave us alone. But I was nervous and didn't know what she was trying to do, so I defaulted to politeness. After a moment or two, my baby dropped her binky onto the floor, and the woman stooped down to grab it for me. But instead of just handing it to me, she put it in her own mouth, supposedly to clean it off, then tried to pop it back into my daughter's mouth. I snatched it and told her I needed to go. She said, "Oh, please, let me hold the baby before you go." I obviously told her no, and started trying to get my older daughter's attention so that we could leave. The woman then said, "Oh, I just love babies. I just can't help it," and grabbed my daughter from my arms. She then started inching away from me. By this point, I was petrified and furious. I firmly said, "Give me back my child," lunged for her, and grabbed my baby back. I had to practically push her away from me. She had started scooting closer again, as soon as the baby was out of her arms. I grabbed my older girl and hightailed it out of the building, hoping to escape as fast as I could. As I approached my car, I realized that the woman had followed us out to the parking lot. She was still gushing. "Oh, you have 2 beautiful babies. I just love babies. I love them." I felt sick to my stomach. I realized that while I was buckling the baby into her car seat, my 2-year-old would be standing next to me, or this crazy woman could potentially grab her. And sure enough, she was inching closer and closer to us every second. I was certain at this point that she was going to try to steal one of my kids. I was shaking and close to tears, but my adrenaline kicked in, and I was somehow able to pick up both kids and buckle them safely in the car, without letting go of them. As I was pulling away, I watched a woman in my rearview mirror. She just stood there in the parking lot, watching my car, until we were out of sight. I didn't go back to the library for a long time after that. This isn't my own encounter, but my mother's experience from when she was around 19 and 21 years old. She lived alone in a small unit in Richmond, Melbourne, and worked night shifts at a restaurant. Because she worked nights, she would sleep during the day and wake up around 2 to 3 p.m. She had a friend who visited her place regularly around the time she woke up, and they would eat a meal together and hang out for a couple of hours. This was a part of my mom's daily routine. One night, my mom was at the laundromat, alone, and she noticed a smallish, young European or Middle Eastern, macho-looking man unloading a washing machine full of baby clothes, like a huge amount of baby clothes. To my mom, the whole scene looked out of place. The guy didn't seem right. His demeanor didn't fit the load of baby clothing he was hauling into his basket. The man looked over at my mom, stared at her, but my mom mentioned that she didn't think much about it at the time. She left shortly after with her load and drove back to her unit. A couple of weeks later, my mom finished her shift at work and drove back to her place and went to bed. Woke up the next day in the afternoon and soon heard a knock at her front door. Assuming it was her friend, she started walking down the hallway, where you could see a frosted window at the end. She saw a smallish figure, the exact size as her friend, and didn't have any thought that it could be someone other than who she expected. My mom said that when she was halfway down the hallway, Her body suddenly stopped in its tracks, and an immediate overwhelming feeling of crippling fear came over her. She was frozen and staring at the shape of the figure outside for a minute when an unknown voice said something like, "Hey, come open the door. It's me." My mom slowly walked down the hallway and into her bedroom. She waited in her room for the unknown visitor to leave, but he didn't. Every couple of minutes, he would say things like, "Come on, let me in. I know you're in there. Why don't you just open the door?" According to my mom, she waited in her room for maybe 2 hours, listening to the stranger calling out to her. She couldn't call anyone, because the phone was in her kitchen, and she didn't have the bravery to leave her room, as the unit was tiny and easily accessible. She was afraid the person outside would hear her and find a way to get inside. She mentioned that after waiting for so long, she couldn't handle the cold temperature of her room, as she was barely wearing anything. No, she had only been sleeping beforehand. She finally got the guts to jump up and bolt from her room to the kitchen, which had a back door. She ran out the back door and down the street behind her unit. She had a neighbor who she was friends with and went straight to their place. She explained what happened, and they both looked out the person's window, which had a view of my mom's unit, since their street was in a U-shape. They could see the stranger still standing at the front of my mom's door. He was the same man from the laundromat a few weeks earlier. And they called the police, but the man left before anyone came. After the incident, my mom stayed at her parents' house for a few days. Soon, she felt that she was safe to go live in her own unit again. A couple of weeks after moving back to her unit, she begins receiving notes and letters under her door and on her front steps. According to my mom, the letters had strange things written on them. She never told me what was written, but she mentioned that the sentences and words were extremely amateur, as if written by a 6-year-old. Letters were squiggly, written back to front and arranged in strange sequences. My mom would give the notes into the police station. They weren't treated as much of a threat. This continued for maybe a few weeks or a month. One day, my mom woke up in the afternoon after a previous night shift. It was just another regular day, but she felt that she needed to go and spend a night at her parents' house. She left, spent the night, and got a call the next day to find that the strange man from the first incident had returned to her unit around the same time she left. He made his way to the back of her unit with an axe and immediately started axing down her back door like a madman. He was seen by a neighbor who called the police. However, the man left before the police came. Anyway, it turned out the man's description, partnered with the strange notes my mom was receiving, fit the policeman's belief that the man was a suspect of the rape and murder of a number of girls in Melbourne from the 70s onwards. He wasn't caught, and I don't know if he ever was. He's most likely still out there. I found a site that might contain possible murders by the baby man. I also wondered if a few of the men around the ages of 56 and over, with pedophilia and murder crimes on this site, could possibly be the baby man. The first time she spoke to me, it was to tell me I looked like her stillborn daughter. Several years ago, I was a freshman in college in a small Midwest town, and had just gotten a job working one of those kiosks in the mall, the type that people attempt to walk by without being noticed. It was boring as hell, but it was all I could get. Due to my class schedule, I had a pretty set routine that my boss let me work around. I opened every Tuesday and Thursday, and usually closed on the weekends. And it was the morning shifts that started it all. At first, I thought it was a pretty sweet gig. Be at the mall by 9 to get things set up. Then I could study or read until things started to pick up. Usually it was just the older couples that time of morning, who would power walk laps around the mall. Over the weeks, I started recognizing the same people. I realized there was always this one woman, 60s, short and kind of overweight. She wasn't power walking like the others, but just shuffled around the mall. I usually saw her go past me a couple of times each morning. Never said anything outright, but she'd mumble to herself and take quick glances at me before moving on. I didn't think much of it. This continued for a while, shuffle, mumble, a few looks, moved on. Then one morning, I was sitting on my stool, and I heard a voice, much too close behind me, say, "You look like her." I flipped around, and saw this woman, not 2 feet behind me. I was startled, but tried to be polite, so I asked who she meant. "My daughter." This woman didn't seem too crazy anymore. She actually looked kinda annoyed at me. I asked what her daughter's name was, and she replied that her daughter didn't have a name, that she had been a stillborn. She said the dead didn't get to have names. Then she asked what my name was. At this point, I was starting to freak out. The woman was staring straight in my eyes as if she was trying to see through me. I really had no response. What do you say to a slightly demented old woman who says you remind her of her dead baby? I didn't tell her my name either. It didn't feel right. So I kinda just laughed nervously and put some space between us. She stared for a few seconds more, then she grunted at me. Yes, she grunted, and shuffled off. I was creeped out the rest of the day and kept looking over my shoulder. By the end of the night, I wrote it off as a lonely old woman with no social skills and tried to forget it. My next morning shift, I saw her crouched behind a garbage can glaring at me. I don't know how long she had been there, but she was just staring. I did my best to ignore her. This lasted a few minutes before she continued her normal shuffle and mumble routine. She didn't speak again until a couple weeks later. This time, I saw her approaching me and braced myself for more weirdness. I fully expected another dead daughter comment, but she actually said nothing. Just walked right up to me, stared into my eyes, and said nothing. I said, can I help you with something?" This time, she didn't seem annoyed with me. She actually seemed angry. "You look like her. You shouldn't look like her. The dead don't get names, but you do." Then she shuffled off before I could say a thing. And a few days later, she asked if I knew her daughter. A couple days after that, she asked me why I lived, and her daughter didn't. She just made no sense whatsoever. I was getting angry instead of just uneasy. She'd been staring at me, sometimes crouched around garbage cans to do so, and saying weird things to me for weeks now. So, I said something I shouldn't have. I wasn't the smartest person back then. I basically told her I didn't know her, didn't want to know her, and sure as hell didn't want to hear about her dead kid anymore. I felt bad for saying it, but I was getting pissed off. She was freaking me out, and I thought if I stood up for myself, that she would leave me alone. And she did for a few days, but then I started seeing her on my closing shifts on the weekends. Up till now, I had only been seeing her in the mornings. She didn't come up to me anymore, maybe because it was busier in the mall this time of day, but she took to sitting on a bench not too far away and staring at me while mumbling to herself. She also seemed different. Before, she always seemed half lost, a little slow physically, and just unsure of herself. Now she seemed very clear-headed and determined. She also shuffled faster than before. She even sat on the bench with more purpose, almost like focusing on me had given her new energy. I should have gone to my boss well before now, but I honestly thought she was just a weirdo, and she wasn't approaching me or talking about her daughter anymore, so I thought I'd taken care of it. Then, one afternoon, as I was leaving the mall, I had just gotten into my car, and I noticed she was standing on the sidewalk entrance I had just left, and she was staring right at me, in my car. This time, I started to get genuinely scared. I hadn't seen her at all that day, so I'm not sure if she had been watching the whole time or not. I sped out of there, checking the rearview mirror to make sure she hadn't sprouted wings and forked a tongue to chase me down. This is where I mention the detail that makes me truly stupid. The lock on my car had been sticking lately and didn't always lock right. I had been meaning to get it looked at, but I was a poor college student and a procrastinator. Plus, it was a piece of junk car anyway, and nothing worth stealing inside. So I didn't get the locks fixed, even knowing there was a crazy old woman keeping tabs on me at work. Worst mistake of my life, I know. Believe me, I know. I didn't see her for a few shifts after that. I even checked around the parking lot before going to my car. Nothing. So I started to write her off again. And then came the day everything changed. I hadn't seen her in the mall, and didn't see her in the parking lot, so I got in my car and started to drive off. I didn't even realize she was in my back seat for a few minutes because she wasn't saying anything. She must have crawled in at some point during the day and hidden on the floor. All I knew was that I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her sitting calmly in the back seat, staring at me through the mirror. I yelled. The car swerved. Not sure how I managed to stay on the road. I was terrified and angry all at once. I asked what the hell she was doing in my car, and she said she wanted to introduce me to her daughter. I reminded her that her daughter was dead, and she said, "I know." I should have just stopped the car and ran for it, but she grabbed my elbow with a surprisingly strong grip for her age and told me to keep driving. I asked where she wanted me to drive to, but she didn't answer for a while. I avoided my neighborhood altogether. I thought about driving to the local police department, or even fire department, but I didn't know where they were. My phone was in my purse, which I'd thrown in the passenger seat, and couldn't reach it with her death grip on my right arm. She started mumbling that her daughter was a little ways away, and she wanted me to take us to her. "You need to meet her. My daughter." "Your daughter died when she was a baby." "You look alike." There was no weapon, no direct threat, so I kept driving. She started giving me very specific directions to a street address I didn't recognize. I followed those directions for maybe 10 minutes, trying to think of a solid game plan before she told me to pull over. I realized we were outside of a cemetery. Not one of those rundown horror movie cemeteries, but a well-kept one. The flowers and fresh grass didn't make it any more welcoming. This is the closest I came to shitting my pants. I was crying at this point, and thought maybe she was planning some murder-suicide thing, or was going to sacrifice me over her kid's grave. I don't know. She was smiling now through the rearview mirror. She looked kinder when she was glaring. She started tugging on my elbow and pointing into the graveyard, saying I had to come with her. I asked her why. "If she had lived, she would be you. Come see her, so she can be you." I got out of the car, and so did she. She grabbed my hand and started pulling me towards the headstones. I broke away, dove in the car, and peeled out of there before she could grab me again. I saw her standing on the curb staring after me, and she looked angry. I never went back to the mall. Called my boss after that, explained what had been going on, and that I quit. He understood, but said I should have said something a long time ago. Honestly, he probably thought I was making up the most lame excuse for quitting ever. I realize this all sounds crazy, and I did call the police after I got home. But to my knowledge, they never found her. I never saw her again. Looking back, I see she was mentally ill. Sometimes I feel bad for her. Mostly, I just make sure to always lock my doors from now on.